Severity refers to the consequence of an accident when it does occur. Minor, marginal, serious, catastrophic. You can assign numbers 1 to 5 to the probabilities and 1 to 4 to the severity. By multiplying those numbers together, you find your R value or risk assessment value. For example, if your risk assessment tells you that a task is probable, 4, and would have serious consequences, 3, then the R value will be 4 times 3 equals 12. Establish and follow procedures to collect, analyze, and review performance data in order to determine the probability and severity of an accident. You should consider both leading and lagging indicators. Leading indicators reflect the potential for injuries and illnesses that have not yet occurred. These include things like the level of worker participation in safety training, the number of hazards and close calls reported, the number and frequency of inspections, and the number of hazards identified during inspections. Other examples include employee safety suggestions, time spent responding to reports, number of walkthroughs, time taken for maintenance, number of workers trained, time taken to correct hazards, employee opinions about the program. Lagging indicators generally track worker exposures and injuries that have already occurred. These include the number and severity of injuries and illnesses that have occurred, the results of worker exposure monitoring, and the amount paid to workers' compensation claims. Verify program implementation. In addition to monitoring progress, verify that employees are actually implementing the program. In particular, check that reporting, inspections, progress tracking, and data collection procedures are taking place. This is an excellent opportunity to involve employees in the evaluation process. They can help review accident reports and exposure monitoring results, choose and track performance indicators, and suggest areas to adjust the program. Correct and improve. If any problem areas in the program are identified, act quickly to fix them and prevent them from happening again. Also, it's not enough to simply take suggestions for program improvement as they come. Actively seek recommendations from managers and employees alike. Be flexible. Over the years, equipment, machinery, materials, personnel, and work practices will change. The program should change along with them. Employers need to evaluate the program initially and at least annually to ensure that it operates as intended, effectively controls identified hazards, and progresses toward established safety and health goals and objectives. The scope and frequency of program evaluations will vary depending on changes in OSHA standards, the program's scope, complexity, maturity, and the types of hazards it must control. Communication and coordination for host employers, contractors, and staffing agencies. Most employers occasionally have other employers' workers present in their workplace, including janitorial staff, temporary clerical support, or specialized services such as electricians or mechanics. These workers can be exposed to safety or health hazards present in your workplace. The host company must take responsibility for all workers, including contract and staffing agency workers. Employers must establish mechanisms to coordinate their efforts and communicate information to ensure that all workers on site and their representatives can participate in efforts to prevent and control injuries and illnesses and that workers are afforded equal protection against hazards. Many public sector organizations are not under the jurisdiction of federal OSHA or even state OSHA, but the contract companies are under an occupational safety agency that will regulate and cite them for violations. However, local government officials have a moral obligation to make sure that workers of all types who do business with them are protected from hazards. Outline the procedures and processes for coordinating safety and health responsibilities as well as on the procedures for communicating between the host employer and contractor, subcontractor, or temporary staffing agency. Document these in writing. To keep the workers safe, the company should communicate with all outside contractors the importance of worker safety. Coordinate with supervisors, owners, and workers throughout the project to make sure the worksite is safe. Hold all workers and agencies accountable for operating a safe worksite. Verify that the bids and contracts specify that safe work practices are a must for working with the company. A safety culture will protect the workers from injury and illness because the company places a value on the lives of the workers. A deep commitment to a safety culture will lead to worker retention and organizational benefits far beyond regulatory compliance.
293.
Bravo.
I onda ovaj mali fugasom 350.
Bravo. Ok, sad čekaj kad bude kako se već zove pao protiv sedmica. Pa kad te opali sa fugastu, kao da te je VV opalio.
Šta je bilo?
Joj, nemam onoga ništa za spotanje, ne mogu ništa odspotati. U ovom bajči je 165. Pa kad padne protiv sedmica, la, što će delovi da lete. A ovo što će delovi da lete od mene, ovde sad.
Hazard prevention and control comes from all levels of the organization, including the chief executive officer and extending all the way down to the workers themselves. A safety management system depends on individual responsibility and a system that can prevent hazards across all work activities. What is a JHA? One of the most common systems for identifying and preventing hazards on a job site is through a job hazard analysis, JHA. A JHA helps workers identify the specific hazards associated with the different steps of a task. Unlike a standard operating procedure, SOP, which only shows employees how to perform the task, a JHA includes additional information about the hazards associated with each component of a job. It is common to develop a JHA by starting with the SOP to get the steps outlined in chronological order. The safety committee, which should include a selection of the working crew, can dissect the steps to see if and where a hazard may present itself. Any job can benefit from a job hazard analysis. However, some should receive priority. Think about all the jobs on the worksite and then consider which poses the most significant potential hazards to employees. JHA should analyze all possible risks from the ground up. These could include trip hazards, falling objects, overhead obstructions, weather, poisonous plants, etc. While JHAs may seem like a time-consuming precaution, they can prevent severe occupational injuries or illnesses when they're done correctly. They increase each employee's awareness of workplace hazards and provide an opportunity to identify and control them. Additionally, they can increase productivity. While JHAs may seem like a small thing, they are one of the most important tasks that can be done on any job site because they ensure the safety of all other tasks. Many JHAs can be started by using the SOP to outline steps chronologically. Go through each step of a specific task and think about the following. What can go wrong? What are the consequences? How could it arise? What are other contributing factors? How likely is it that the hazard will occur? When describing the possible hazards, be specific. Think about the most critical contributors to the hazard. These could include where it is happening, who or what it is happening to, the explosion, what precipitates or triggers the hazard, the outcome or consequence that would occur should it happen, and any other contributing factors. Once the hazard or hazards are identified, then the workers will look to the hierarchy of controls to see if they can either eliminate the hazard, substitute it, engineer a control, use existing or new work rules as an administrative control, or, as a last resort, wear personal protective equipment during that step. Once the proper controls have been determined, a JHA worksheet should be filled out and kept for the review of the employees prior to performing the task. The workers can review the JHA repeatedly to determine the completeness of tasks and the total identification of hazards. Some JHAs can be done in advance for jobs that are routine, while others are done on-site right before beginning the task. However, even JHAs that are done prior should be revisited by the work team before any work begins. If there is any doubt as to the steps, hazards, or hazard controls, then the work should not proceed until all questions have been answered. View source. Sample JHA. This job involves a worker grinding iron castings to remove burrs left by a previous operation. To accomplish this, he reaches into a metal box to the right of the grinder to get a 15-pound casting. He then carries it to the grinding wheel and grinds off the burrs. He does this 20 to 30 times per hour. Let's consider step 1 of the following task. The JHA for step 1 of this process would include the following. Hazard recognition. A hazard is anything that can
Challenger je
injure or
pobjegao
hurt an
nazad,
individual.
Crusader je verovatno
The
pobjegao
presence
nazad,
of
Dicky
hazards
Max
in a
je pobjegao.
workplace does not necessarily mean injuries or accidents will
A
occur.
T20 je
An
sakriveno
accident
ime,
requires
znači
both
on
the
je
presence
pobjegao.
of a hazard and exposure to the hazard in order to occur. A JHA should identify whether the hazard itself or the exposure to the hazard is the primary concern. For example, in a trenching or excavation operation, a cave-in is possible even when no workers are present. Only when workers are present would it be considered an accident because only then are workers exposed to it. Hazard recognition should be first and foremost taught to the frontline supervisors who have control over the work conditions affecting both them and the workers they supervise. Hazard recognition must also be taught at the level of each worker as they become employed at the facility. Some hazards, such as working at heights, are fairly obvious, but there are also hazards that may not be as obvious. Workers may be exposed to an odorless toxic fume, for example, meaning they would not be aware that they are being poisoned. This is a common hazard in confined spaces. Hazard types. Hazard types help classify hazards according to what negative effects they might have on
Joj, nemoj
workers.
sad ga
Examples
prebacivati,
of
Bog
hazard
te
types
mazo.
are ergonomic, caught in, contact,
Nemoj ga sad prebaciti,
chemical
dvije,
exposure,
znači me
flammable
prebaci.
liquids, laceration, falls to
Pa ja
below,
danas sa Kinezom,
falls to the
tem da
same
stavim
level,
pomoću FV-a,
mechanical,
prebacio ga.
Ja,
engulfment.
Bog te mazo
There
kod
are many
Skedina,
more
ono.
hazard
1005
types that
glava,
are
ja
job
prebacio.
specific, so the worker
Prebaci
must be
ga. Ja
trained to
sam, ma
recognize
dobro,
these
nema šta, ja
hazards from the first day
podbacivam,
of
znači
work.
većina granata
Once the hazards are
nemaju dovoljno
identified, the
barta
next
unutra.
stage is to learn how to control them and prevent them from injuring workers.
T52 je ovdje kod njih.
Hierarchy of hazard controls. Controlling exposures to occupational hazards is the fundamental method of protecting workers. Traditionally, a hierarchy of controls has been used as a means of determining how to implement
ovo moram da
feasible and
slikam da mi
effective control
objasnite
solutions.
kako je lik
One
tu pogodio
representation of
mene,
this
a
hierarchy
front
is
je
as
isprebio me.
follows. View source. The idea behind this hierarchy is that the control methods at the top of graphic are potentially more effective and
Baš na
protective
foču
than those
onaj
at the bottom.
tepih pozadi, ono na
Following this
sredini, ali baš
hierarchy
pozadi.
normally leads to the implementation of inherently
tu me
safer
probušio.
systems, where the
Znači,
risk of illness or injury has been
prošla
substantially
kroz moju
reduced.
kupolu,
The following are the
spičila me
levels of the
u
hierarchy
džobu.
of controls. Eliminating the hazard. Substituting one substance or process for another. Engineering controls. Administrative controls. Personal protective equipment, PPE.
Idemo, nisam bio onaj. Lampica mi se nije upala. A ja palan. Nemam opreme na njemu nikakve.
Da, joj.
Imam opreme da sam mogao odmah da ga spotam kad je prolazio, ali nisam imao opreme da ga spotam i čovjek me čvakno, pobježe mać i ne može ništa ospotati. Šta god bilo biće, idemo dalje. Za iste pare.
Kurve i piće, koku na glaviće.
Eliminating the hazard is the primary way to protect workers. If workers do not have any exposure to that hazard because it is not present, then they will not be injured or harmed.
Pa ja nemam ništa za to.
Substituting one substance or process for another is a secondary way to protect workers from injury or illness. For example, if there is work with the gas chlorine and the workplace decides to go to liquid bleach, that substitution would protect the workers from exposure to a hazardous gas. Engineering controls create a physical barrier between the worker and the hazard point. This physical barrier is not something that can easily be removed without worker intervention. An example is the machine guard on a table saw. If workers want to use the table saw without the machine guard, they would have to physically take off that guard and then operate the machinery. Administrative controls are work rules set by the employer to protect workers from injuries or illnesses. A work rule, policy, or procedure along with the employer's safety culture, are company norms that will translate into tangibly better outcomes. An example of an administrative control is to have workers read the procedure on how to safely do a task. This procedure would be detailed, identify the hazards, and help the worker select the appropriate control for that hazard.
Su oni riješili su jednoga. Ga njihov 75 ode na nas.
Personal protective equipment, PPE, is the last line of defense for worker safety and health because, even when using PPE, they are still exposed to that hazard. If the worker must still be exposed to a hazard even after other controls are implemented,
Dobili disconnect.
then PP Hazard Control Hierarchy. The prevention and control of hazards protect workers from injury and illness. Arrange the elements of the hierarchy of controls in the correct order. Start by selecting an option from the list, then use the arrows to
Nemoj
arrange
me
it in the correct
handriti,
order.
disconnectuj se više.
Šta je bilo?
Nemam pojma, pukao sam, znači neće da me disconnectuje kako treba. Jedva znači. Idem da se prodam.
Ne možeš se prodavati.
Dečak je propao tamo. Samo jedan put postoji napolje. Samo jedan je put postojao napolje i on nije mogao eto. Ajoj, tamo i sedmica stoji pored njega, ne možeš ga ospotati.
Careful. The order is not correct. There is a hierarchy of hazard control. Elimination. Substitution. Risk transfer. Engineering controls. Administrative controls. Personal protective equipment, PPE. Careful. The order is not correct. There is a hierarchy of hazard control. Elimination. Substitution. Risk transfer. Engineering controls. Administrative controls.
Šta si našao da psuješ? Ne, psovanje.
Careful. The order is not correct. Excellent. There is a hierarchy of hazard control. Elimination. Risk analysis. Risk analysis is a way to understand the nature and complexity of a hazardous condition. A proper risk analysis is done through assessing the risk involved for the workers when confronted with a hazard. Usually, risk analysis includes the probability of the hazard creating an accident and the likelihood that the incident will result in an injury or illness of a certain severity. Therefore, risk is calculated by multiplying the probability an event will happen by the expected severity. Probability is often divided into 5 levels: improbable, remote, occasional, probable, and frequent. In most risk analyses, each probability category can be assigned a number between 1 and 5. The severity factors also are delineated into levels, this time 4 of them: negligible, marginal, critical, and catastrophic. Similar to the probability factor, numbers between 1 and 4 are assigned to the severity factors. Using this system, an assessment can be performed that yields a specific number to describe the risk level and classify the hazard. Combined with the human error factor, the probability and severity may both increase any hazard that has a high risk. Example: a worker in a laboratory is using acid without any hand protection. The probability of a chemical burn is high enough to warrant the top level of likelihood of an event occurring, which is a 5. The consequence of a chemical burn will yield a severity of 3. Calculating the risk of this use of acid in a laboratory without hand protection, therefore, yields a risk factor of 15. Using the maximum scale of 20, the highest probability of 5 multiplied by the highest severity of 4, shows that this action by the worker is a high-risk activity. In this example, the use of chemicals without proper PPE has an element of behavioral deficiency. This at-risk behavior can be identified through a behavioral-based safety inspection and then addressed through training.
Zgravim poput igra, uhvatio sam se za muda, krešovalo mi u sred brda i naravno da sam mrtav.
Normalno, što si ti mislio? I meni isto malo prije krešalo, samo što sam bio iza, pa nismo me ubili tada, nego kasnije kad se sve povratilo.
Lesson summary. There are many cost factors related to accidents that can be direct or indirect. The direct costs of an accident are directly associated with the event and are easily quantifiable. Most direct costs are paid by the insurance company of the employer. The indirect costs of an accident are not paid through the insurance and, therefore, are unrecoverable. The components of a safety program include management leadership, worker participation, hazard identification and assessment, hazard prevention and control, education and training, program evaluation and improvement, communication and coordination for host employers, contractors, and staffing agencies. A hazard is anything that can injure or hurt an individual. Hazard identification is vital to understanding how an accident can happen. Hazard types are ways to classify what specifically the hazard is to the worker. One of the most common ways for workers to visualize hazards prior to undertaking a job is through job hazard analysis, JHA. A JHA identifies the steps required to perform a task, the hazards associated with each step, and the controls necessary to mitigate the hazards. Once hazards are identified, they must be controlled to prevent illness or injury. The hierarchy of controls ranks these in order of preference. Complete elimination of hazard, most preferred, through substitution of hazardous material or task, engineering controls, administrative controls, and finally wearing personal protective equipment, PPE, the last resort. For individual hazards, an employer may need to perform a risk analysis to determine the risk associated with those hazards. Risk is calculated by assigning numbers between 1 and 5 to the probability level and numbers between 1 and 4 to the severity, then multiplying the probability an event will happen by the expected severity.
O, bravo.
Će probamo još pazun 3 partije sa Windkundom da dobijem neku ravnu mapu.
Blokiraj
Lesson 2.
brodovite mape.
Accident causation and investigation.
Windkund, dobio sam donekle
Lesson
ravnu mapu,
focus.
tepe.
At the end of this lesson,
Ali
students will be able to
čukurac da
understand the following.
probijem, čukurac
Accident
da
causation,
probijem ja. Tu su
accident
10
theories, incident
jebaće me,
investigation techniques, behavior-based safety programs. Understanding
Jel ima
accident
neka šestica
causation.
što skida 600 i brzo puni
OSHA
tvrde?
strongly encourages employers to investigate all workplace
Huh?
accidents, both
ima
those
neka
that
šestica
cause
što
harm and
brzo
the close
puni i
calls that
tvrda
could
je?
have caused harm under slightly different
Brzo
circumstances.
puni i tvrda je.
Investigating a worksite
I skida
accident, a
600.
fatality, injury, illness, or
Ima
close call
KV2.
allows employers and workers to
Ne, da se
identify
napravi
hazards
onda
in their
TD za
operations and
šestice.
shortcomings in their safety and health programs.
Uzmi te
Most important,
Ima,
it
uzmeš
enables employers and
su
workers
sto
to
i staviš mu
identify
to
and
po negdje.
implement the corrective actions necessary to prevent future incidents.
Ali on
To
tvrdi,
22
Accident
minuta.
investigations that focus on identifying and correcting root causes, not on finding fault or blame,
Prene
also
štalima i
improve workplace morale and
jebem
increase
pičku.
productivity by demonstrating an employer's commitment to a safe and healthful workplace. To understand accident
Sve što je
causation,
od tebe,
investigations rely on the
reči
idea that most
najslađe,
accidents are caused by human error. Therefore, if you learn the cause and effect relationship between accident causation and the human element, then you can reduce injuries and illnesses. Though there are additional factors to consider, the human element is a leading cause of accidents. There is a difference between accidents and
Narod,
incidents.
dan,
Accidents
kupi
denote a
vrata, počinje da
significant
ludi.
loss as a part of an unintended event, and an incident denotes an unintended event that possibly doesn't result in a loss. In this session, we will refer to incidents and accidents as interchangeable because the outcome, in this context, is not as
Oklop
relevant
nije
as the
pogođen
causes
u
are.
Senici.
For an
O
accident to
ljebe,
happen,
dragi.
two factors must be present: the hazard and exposure to the hazard. A hazard is anything that will harm you through contact. Exposure is how
Znači, vi
susceptible you
su,
are
što se
to an
kaže,
injury or illness due
prišli,
to being near or in contact with a hazardous
brzo.
substance, material, or condition. Accident causation
Ali
models
neće
deal
tako
with
brzo,
controlling,
nabrzo, zato što
eliminating
smo nabrali da
exposure,
stisnem
or
X.
eliminating, substituting, or controlling the hazard.
Ma džabe ovi se poštekal
Accident
na
theories.
šest.
No,
It's
to je ta
important to
izgubljena
recognize
partija.
the fundamental reasons behind accidents.
Da,
Studying
to se-
accident theories can help us understand precisely why accidents happen and how various risk factors interact to create adverse outcomes. With knowledge of these theories, companies can foster a strong safety culture and implement measures that will
Popni
help
se
mitigate potential
mrcino,
hazards. The
smrdljiva,
following are
kaljava
brief introductions
Nemačka.
to these theories.
Jeboti Hitler
Single factor
mater.
theory. The single factor theory for accident investigation is the most basic of the accident causation models. This theory assumes that one event is solely responsible for an accident. It is akin to the pilot error syndrome, which states that the cause of an airplane accident was solely an error caused by the pilot. In modern accident causation models, the single factor theory has little value and is rarely used because it is too simplistic. H. W. Heinrich's domino theory. In 1931, H. W. Heinrich presented what is known as the domino
To je
theory.
lepo kad te spotaju.
Heinrich was an occupational safety researcher who based this theory on data from thousands of workplace accidents. The first principle of this theory addressed the cause of accidents, claiming that an injury always results from a complete sequence of factors, with the final factor being the accident itself. The image commonly used to illustrate this principle is a lineup of dominoes, which eventually became known as the domino theory. In this model, Heinrich states that removing one of the dominoes, preferably the middle unsafe act or condition domino, would have prevented the accident. This theory demonstrates that there is never a single cause of an accident or injury. There were several models of this theory. In all the models, there are three phases that are influencers of an accident. These phases are: pre-contact phase prior to the event happening, contact phase, which refers to the event as it's happening, post-contact phase, which refers to after the release of unplanned energy, the product downtime, or the injury or illness. In a later model of the domino theory, managerial influence and managerial error dominoes were added. In the later model, loss was organizational loss as opposed to just an accident.
A ne
An
može
example
ništa.
of organizational loss could be property damage, loss of public trust, as well as an illness or injury. A criticism of the domino theory holds that more dimensional approaches were required because an accident might have multiple factors and causes that don't operate in a linear fashion.
Prvi sam
Today,
izginuo.
the domino theory is not widely used. The idea that accidents result from
divno.
several factors is widely accepted. However, rather than
Napravo
occurring in an
jednu
ordered
Ali
sequence,
sam četvrti po
accidents are now
iskustvu.
seen as a more complex web of factors that can interact with each other in many
What the
ways.
fuck?
A dobro biti četvrti, iskreno. Se ne lažemo. To je baš
Seksi.
unikatno. I šakše.
Multiple factor theory. The multiple factor theory, also called the multiple causation theory, says that accidents are not caused by a single factor, but by a
misija.
combination of many elements.
Jebala
According
ti
to this
misije, bre.
theory, accidents happen when many
Kampanja.
unsafe factors converge and create an incident.
Ne možeš
These
opet.
factors can include inadequate supervision, poor training, and unsafe conditions. The
Što?
multiple factor theory looks at not just the three
Govorim njemu.
phases in the domino theory,
Šta?
Ne
pre-contact,
šaltaj mi kampanje.
contact, and post-contact,
A već me
but
tamo ne
also
igram
other
na tvoj
factors that influence an
gluvaču
action.
jedan gluvi.
Multiple factor theories analyze things such as management, the machines, the media,
Znači,
and the man.
ovaj
The role of
cijel-
management would be to create
ima
the
rampi,
organizational
ima
structures,
rampi.
the policy, and the procedures that ensure safety. The machinery includes
A
the
hoćemo ga
design,
nabiti
shape,
danas?
size, and type of
Neću.
equipment or materials being used. The
Će
role
da
of
ture
media
ono
can be
grudvanje.
described as an environmental
Ponovo.
factor that might
Sutra
influence
grudvanje.
worker or manager behavior, while the factor of the
Sutra
man
znači
includes
prvo-
gender,
prvo 2
age,
sata znači
mentality,
grudvanja ide.
fatigue factors, height, weight, etc. The theory proposes
igraš
that
ono i
addressing
budžeš
and
experience
eliminating unsafe
na ono.
factors will reduce the likelihood
Sutra.
of an accident. Management's role is to create
Da,
organizational
ti si
structures,
rekao 2 sata, znači
policies,
2 sata
and
ti igraš samo
procedures
dužeš
to
nagrade, a
identify
što ne
and
Samo
igraš,
nagrade
control these
uzeti.
factors
Ništa
to
a što
drugo.
ne
prevent new
igraš, dobiješ
accidents.
XP.
Prevention is key to
Pa,
implementing this
zato
theory
što-
successfully.
Nema potrebe dalje.
Human factor theory.
Da dobijaš opet
The
nagrade
human
neke,
factor
a
theory
i dobijaš
states that
dužeš
every
XP na
accident is
tanku.
caused by human error. This theory analyzes the factors that lead to human error, such as overload, inappropriate activities, and inappropriate responses. Overload doesn't always mean that the worker is overburdened, but the job itself may have excess stressors, such as noise, heat, or unclear instructions. Workers can often feel overloaded when given too many tasks at a time or when work instructions do not clearly define the goals. Frontline supervisors are charged with making sure that the workers understand the steps of each task. There are two types of failures that cause human errors: active failures and latent failures. An active failure is usually
Njega.
caused by the worker or person engaged in an activity. Their actions give an immediate consequence, which is the direct cause of the accident. Latent failures lay the foundation of an active failure due to such issues as ineffective training, poor engineering of the equipment or location, poor or inadequate supervision, ineffective communication, unclear roles for the worker. Swiss cheese theory. This theory, created by James Reason, is based on the analogy of holes in Swiss cheese. In his analysis of an accident, Reason uses a visualization of a complete system with no holes. In a complete system, management is involved, employees are motivated, there is a safety management system in place, and a safety culture exists in the organization. A breakdown of any one of these components creates a hole similar to a hole in a slice of Swiss cheese. As more holes develop, the system becomes less effective and more dysfunctional. Eventually, the holes in each system will line up and allow an accident to occur. This model combines the linear nature of the domino theory with the complexity of the multiple factor theory. For example, an employee handling caustic chemicals may wear gloves, but if the walkway isn't clear, he can still trip.
Ma idi
If the
volan
walkway
zajebi.
is clear and
Eno
he
ga
does not
10,
trip,
45
the container the
naprijed.
chemical is in might be defective and rupture. If the container does not rupture, the chemical may still emit fumes that could impair the worker. The key is to provide a sufficient number of layers of protection and monitor each layer for deficiencies so that they can be corrected.
Napravi
How
medalju.
to use
Ubij
accident
dvojicu koje
theories.
su tebi napravili štetu.
With
To
the
ti
possible
najlakše je
exception
napraviti
of the
medalju.
single factor theory, All of these accident theories could potentially be useful in determining how and why an accident occurred. Most accidents involve some sort of domino-like sequence, even if the time elapsed was very short. Virtually all accidents result from the intersection of multiple factors, and on construction sites in particular, accidents are often the result of too many holes in the layers of protection. The important thing is for employers and employees alike to consider the causes of accidents and take concrete steps to prevent the same accidents from happening again in the future. Every accident should be a learning opportunity. Accident investigation techniques. The investigation process should begin as soon as possible after an incident occurs, but only after arranging for first aid or medical treatment if the accident involves injuries. In getting started, remind everyone involved, especially workers, that the investigation is to learn and prevent, not find fault. The steps of the investigation process should include the following. 1. Call or gather the necessary persons to conduct the investigation. 2. Secure the area where the injury occurred and preserve the work area as it is. 3. Identify and gather witnesses to the event. 4. Interview the involved worker and other witnesses as needed. 5. Document the scene of the injury through photos or videos. 6. Complete the investigation report, including determining what caused the incident and what corrective actions will prevent recurrences. 7. Use results to improve the injury and illness prevention program to better identify and control hazards before they result in incidents. 8. Ensure follow-up on completion of corrective actions. This fact-finding aims to determine all the contributing factors to why the incident occurred. Contributing factors may involve equipment, the environment, people, and management. The following are some of the common techniques used to investigate accidents. Root cause analysis. A root cause analysis is a detailed procedure used by safety professionals to look beyond the initial reactions, which may be informed more by emotion and careful thought, to assign blame for an incident. A root cause is a fundamental, underlying, system-related reason why an incident occurred that identifies one or more correctable system failures. Root causes generally reflect management, design, planning, organizational, or operational failings. For example, a damaged guard had not been repaired. Supervisors routinely overlook failure to use the guard to ensure production speed. By conducting a root cause analysis and addressing root causes, an employer may be able to substantially or entirely prevent the same or a similar incident from recurring. A root cause analysis must be conducted to determine all factors and variables responsible for an accident. Most of these types of analysis will require a team of trained professionals who are familiar with accident causation models, as well as good investigators and critical thinkers. There are many types of root cause analysis, but they all seek to do the same thing: address the source of any accident. The 5 whys. The 5 whys is an accident investigation technique often used by safety professionals to conduct a root cause analysis. It uses quantifiable questions that build on one another to get closer and closer to that cause. Using this technique, the investigator records answers to a series of questions to get beyond the superficial yes or no answers. As each question is answered, the investigator uncovers more reasons for an accident. Although this technique is called the 5 whys, it often takes more questions than that to get to the root cause. This technique has to be rigorously applied if one wants to identify a root cause. If a series of questions always stops at human causes, a systematic or mechanical cause could remain unknown, and the actual root cause might never be found. Here is an example of how the 5 whys can be used to investigate an accident. A worker receives a laceration from touching an unguarded blade on a hand rip saw. Using the 5 whys technique for questioning, the investigator can begin with these questions. Why did the worker receive a laceration? Why did the worker touch the unguarded blade? Why was the guard not on the saw? Why did the worker believe it is better to work faster and not safer? Why is management placing a greater importance on production quotas over safety? In this brief example, the use of production quotas indirectly led to the worker valuing speed over safety. There may be many other factors related to why the worker received a laceration in the scenario, such as poor organizational safety culture, lack of training, management and supervisors having unfair expectations of production quotas, workers fearing retribution for slowing down production to address safety concerns, upper management condoning and/or rewarding production goals over safety concerns. When conducting a 5 whys accident analysis, the investigator will dig deeper to uncover an accident's cause. This new revelation may lead the organization to address gaps in their safety management system. The 5 whys is an accident investigation technique often used by safety professionals to conduct a root cause analysis. It uses quantifiable questions that build on one another to get closer and closer to that cause. Why did the worker receive a laceration? Because he touched an unguarded blade. Why did the worker touch the unguarded blade? Because the guard was not placed on the saw. Why was the guard not on the saw? Because the worker believed he could work faster without the guard. Why did the worker believe it is better to work faster and not safer? Because the worker gets paid on a quota basis. Why is management placing a greater importance on production quotas over safety? Because management receives a bonus for achieving production quotas.
Oh my God.
Theories of accidents. If you learn the cause and effect relationship of accident causation and the human element, then you can reduce injuries and illnesses. Match the accident theory with the correct description. Correct items are marked with a green color. Incorrect items are indicated with a red color. Select Show Answers to view the correct matches.
Matches? Single, multiple, domino, human Swiss.
Correct items are marked with a green color. Incorrect items are indicated with a red color. Select Show Answers to view the correct matches. Correct items are marked with a green color. Incorrect items are indicated with a red color. Select Show Answers to view the correct matches.
A showman.
Behavior-based
Jao,
safety,
Shoboki.
BBS, programs. A behavior-based safety, BBS, program is designed to improve workplace safety by changing employee behaviors. BBS programs use observation, feedback, and positive reinforcement to encourage safe practices. There are a number of behaviors that can cause a worker to perform work unsafely or below expectations. These performance traps or snares will reveal themselves in a BBS observation. To correct these behaviors, the coach must be able to identify them and must know how to help the worker
Ovo sad se
overcome them.
živi.
A,
The
ljebe,
following
da.
are
Evo,
common
dobio
human
sam neki
performance
40
snares.
poena.
Time
Ne, samo
constraints,
tako nastavi.
interruptions or distractions, multitasking,
Samo tako nastavi,
overconfidence,
znači
vague
samo
guidance, overnight
onaj,
shift
ko te
work,
čvakne ti
peer
njega
pressure,
pokušaj ubiti i tako
change,
dvojicu. To je 10
physical
poena
environment,
zagarantovano.
mental stress. Let's look at each element in more detail.
A jeste.
Time constraints. One of the most common human performance snares arises when workers feel
Gdje
that
će da
they
vidite?
have a time constraint
Ma,
forcing
odšao
them to
negdje.
cut corners.
Evo,
Dođe
There are many
ponovo.
actual time
Hoće.
pressures related to jobs, such
Možda
as
i
due
neće.
dates, daily
Umro.
schedules,
Molim
quotas,
isključiti tuđi
and
internet.
frontline
Normalno da ne
supervision
može.
time crunches. In some
Je,
cases,
pa reći ne
time
radi, sam
pressures
sjedi
are
igra
legitimate
igrice,
and
zjebam
cannot
se.
be
Pa da.
easily adjusted. In an
Ja bih rekao,
emergency
nije konju.
situation, for
Da,
example,
da.
an employee might
da
have
Bog
to
da ti
make
kum bio
important
bici.
decisions rapidly. In such a situation, employees tend to rely on habit strength, meaning they resort to the methods they have used most frequently in the past. As part of a behavior-based safety program, workers will be trained to habitually use safe behaviors, leading them to that habit strength in times of emergencies. However, in some cases, workers use time constraints to avoid safe behaviors that may require more effort or attention than they want to give. In these situations, a coaching session with workers should include
Ja,
tools that can
koliko
help
dobra
deal with
igrica,
time
vrati
constraints.
mi.
The
Yes,
coach can
najbolja.
perform a
Jao,
self-check
i7
or
je
arrange a
spota
peer
na
check to
ovom
see if
gore.
there was truly a time constraint to performing the task.
Koji
A
treba.
pre-job briefing will
Jao,
help workers see
majko
the whole
ti
job and
vargensko
visualize how
jebem
long it will take
picku,
ahead
pa
of time.
dokle više,
A careful consideration
Treba
of the
da
worker's attitude at the
jebem
time of the
da
job
mamo,
could
ja
also
pičku ragu
reveal
bili.
whether they are placing an unreasonable
Mamo vam
amount of
jebem,
time
smrdim
pressure on
pičku.
themselves. Be sure to consider whether policy
I
and
7
procedure
mene
were
spot.
followed for the
To je
employee
bre.
performing the task or whether they were
Ja.
bypassed.
Da, u meni može da se desi.
Interruptions or distractions. In some cases, an at-risk behavior is caused because the worker is distracted or interrupted during the task. In order to successfully coach this individual, there
Bravo.
must be an
Čovjek
assessment
eksplozivno
of
me
what the
rastočio
distraction was and where it came from.
365.
Distractions might arise from the individual worker or from external sources, like another employee's
Nebe,
phone
dragi,
ringing. The
znači,
first step in dealing with
To meni
interruptions
pingaj,
or
to
distractions is to
60
remove
meni
them or
pingaj.
to remove the employee from the distraction area.
Ja ću
The
baš nešto
employee
da
should
sad
perform a system check prior to resuming the task to make sure all conditions are still safe for operations. It may also be a good idea to have the worker seek assistance from a coworker
to
before
znači
resuming work in
Lemming,
order to
Lemming,
assess
i
the
oni napravili
situation
Lemminga,
for
mi
any
napravili
more
Lemminga, a
distractions
ja
or
na ostao na
interrupting
sredini da
factors.
znači napravio.
Ultimately,
Jedan
all
devet, bre,
distractions
idemo.
should be
Evo
removed
te
so
maj-
that the worker can focus on how to perform a
Samo
task
cepaj,
safely.
1-9.
Multitasking. The term multitasking implies
Idi,
that someone can
završi
do
to,
more
idemo
than
sljedeću
one
partiju,
task
ne
at
možeš
the
ništa
exact
tu.
same time.
Tako.
It is nearly impossible for workers to multitask in the purest sense of the
Ajoj.
word. Workers
Tako je.
can, however, try to switch rapidly from one task to the next
A
in
što
order
se
to
vam šatoš, Boki?
multitask. This can become a very dangerous pattern of behavior that can lead to mistakes in one or more of the processes the worker is trying to do at the same time. The worker should prioritize a list of tasks they need to accomplish first. Once a task is accomplished, then the next task in line should be tackled. If the worker feels that they have too many
Sunce,
tasks that are
znači,
due at the same
ček
time,
me,
then
pogodi,
instead of attempting to
koliko sam malo
multitask,
prije
they
rekao?
should